I appreciate you taking the time to attend today, and I would like to thank my panelists for taking the time out of their busy days to share their thoughts with us today. My name's Zach Martin. I'm a senior policy advisor at Venable, and I work with the Better Identity Coalition. Better Identity Coalition is a group of companies committed to working alongside policymakers to improve digital security, privacy, and convenience, and educate those and collaborate on protecting digital identity. I spent roughly 20 years in the digital identity space in a variety of different roles. I started out as a reporter and an editor writing about digital identity. Then I worked as a consultant supporting state and federal agencies with digital identity. And now I work with a variety of different organizations on different digital identity topics. My panelists today have as much, if not more, experience than I do in digital identity, and they're going to have an opportunity to introduce themselves here shortly. But before that, I just want to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork on what we're going to talk about today. Digital identity isn't just one thing. This is something you're going to probably hear a few times today. Digital identity is many different things. But one of the things that is critical to digital identity is that it be inclusive and equitable. Earlier this year, the European Union, the US, and other international partners proposed a declaration for the future of the internet, setting out a vision and principles for a trusted internet that includes human rights and fundamental freedoms. Digital identifiers and attributes are at the core of those human rights, as individuals need to identify themselves in order to access services, pay taxes, and perform a variety of other taxes. But again, digital identity is not just one thing. It's several different pieces of identity attributes, including name, address, identification number, photo, eye color, shoe color. Identity attributes have the potential to change the way digital identity systems work by providing just the necessary information about an individual to enable access. Also, data attributes can be issued by several different organizations, and they can be asserted via many different mechanisms. The discussion today will look at the current state of digital identity and attributes and some of the different technologies and models, and what do policymakers, business leaders, and individuals need to know about these new technologies, such as mobile driver's license, blockchain, and attribute exchange networks. Now I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves and give a brief introduction and answer one question as they're given their introduction. What's the most interesting development happening right now with digital identity? Start with you, Maria.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Maria Vicchino. I'm the CEO of Syntegra. It's a cybersecurity startup. I've been in the digital identity space for almost 20 years. And the thing I'm most looking forward to, that I'm optimistic about, is the emergence of the mobile driver's license. So the problem is today we really don't have a trusted digital identity credential. We don't have a way to really prove ourselves in the digital space, in the United States at least right now. So one of the problems at the moment is that the first thing we need to do when we're online, which, you know, it's anonymous when you're online, to establish that you really are who you say you are, first you need to resolve your identity to a single individual in the United States. So what do? We provide our names, our birth dates, and our social security numbers. So this resolves to a single individual. One of the problems with that is that because of the way our processes are in the United States, you actually can't go against the authoritative sources for this information to even confirm that. So we have a huge problem with synthetic identity fraud in the United States. So even though this information is out there, you have to go against a third-party data source. You cannot go against the US government, even another government agency, because the laws haven't been updated. The Social Security Act was passed in the 1930s. Because it hasn't been updated to take into account the fact that they are the de facto holder of this authoritative data that we need for identity verification online, we have to go to these third-party commercial vendors, and they do have some bad data in their systems because of the years of being able to use synthetic identity and not be able to resolve it. So that's the first part. The second part, if you really want to try to strongly proof yourself online in order to get a secure digital identity credential, what do? Covered up my PII because of the video. You take your piece of plastic, right? And it's got information on it, and it's got a little tiny photo. This photo of me is about 16 years old. The license is still valid. Kind of looks similar, I think. Some people do not after 16 years. And then you take a picture of that with your phone. Now, I have a fairly modern phone. It's about 2 years old. Some people have very old phones with bad cameras. They do it in bad lighting. They're not used to taking photos. They take a picture of this, then you take a picture of yourself, and then you're sending that information to someone else over the internet, along with all of the information on your driver's license. And what do they do with it? They assume, one, that this is actually a photo of you. It doesn't need to be. For $200, I can get an exact copy of this driver's license with someone else's face on it. You can change all the information. It's not secure. And then what you have to do is they're doing that comparison, the facial verification using, biometric algorithms. But the problem is I just took a photo of a photo with a bad camera and then my face. So that's not going to be accurate. And then because we don't have laws requiring the DMVs in the United States to actually verify our data, and the states are the holders of our only real identity credential that's fairly universal in the United States, what happens then? California doesn't let you verify the data. And so you can put anything on there you want as long as it conforms to the standard of the card, and you can have a completely synthetic identity. Or you can steal pieces of other people's information and use it. So what the mobile driver's license will hopefully allow us to do is to have all of that information in our possession, hopefully digitally signed by the authoritative sources, and then enable us to present that so that we can finally, get access to the benefits that we're trying to apply for, be able to open bank accounts securely, and ideally try to reduce the rampant fraud in the United States. So hopefully we are on the right path with the mobile driver's license. So far, it's only been a replacement for the physical card, but hopefully it will start to replace, have these logical access control use cases as well.
Thanks, Maria. My name is Shweta Deval. I'm a specialist leader with Deloitte Cyber Risk Practice. I spend time providing strategy, implementation, and operationalization of complex cybersecurity programs for the federal government with a slight focus which is close to my heart, which is federal health. And with that said, I think Maria touched upon some of those things that we are seeing as innovative in the area of digital identity. But for me, what's exciting is how the new technology and the ability of how the social trends are now driving the world to be more complex. But the requirement for our identity or a digital identity to be more agile. The fact that we live in a physical world and we operate in a virtual world, for me as a user or a service provider, having that identity that can be portable across these different worlds is going to be very, very important. And I think this is a time for revolution, as I'm seeing being in identity for 20 plus years, this is a time for the public sector and the private sector and the industry to come together and provide some clarity around this fragmented identity landscape to make sure that not only me as a user and familiar with the digital world, but also me maybe not in the digital world, having different modalities to make sure I can still operate in the physical and the digital world very, very easily. But with the fact that a lot of these stakeholders are putting an interest on me as an individual. What is my choice? What information about me I want to release? How is my data secured when it's going from A to B? How is that happening? So that kind of transparency as a user is what is exciting, that will drive the whole ecosystem of the evolving agile digital identity. Over to you. Yeah, I can do that.
I'd like to do a live demo. You know what they say about live demos. Ready? You can do this too at home.
Well, if you live in Maryland.
And have an iPhone.
End of demo. If there's one thing that you take away from this conversation, it is the growing importance of digital wallets. So as Marie and others have told you, will tell you, it's really a breakthrough to have a driver's license now part of this. Because guess what else is also there? This is also on that phone. On that phone. My health records are on that phone. If you think about all of identity, all of the internet, there are really three touch points. It's kind of the first part of the internet, Web 1.0, was when it was a push model. Everybody kind of knew each other. We didn't need an identity infrastructure. We're currently living in Web 2.0. What is Web 3.0? We don't know, but we know that it offers an opportunity, the last opportunity for us as citizens, as consumers, as users, as patients, to interact, to have control over the identity data about us. As it stands now, as we talked about, no matter what you put on this phone, and in addition to all these things, my hotel key soon will be on this phone. Marriott wants me to do that. And Tesla is going to give me a key to this. So that makes it kind of interesting, which is all this functionality. This is going away, right? I don't need this stuff for much. So if this becomes a custodian of our identity, all these attributes, who we are, where we live, our health status, my COVID status, this is the platform of the future. This is where identity is going to be its most profound in our lives. And guess what? This smartphone, it's an Apple, the Google iOS system, and the Chinese identity infrastructure are the only options. No other rails to move identity data from. Even in the blockchain or distributed ledgers, you're still moving identity data through iOS or through Android or through Weibo. So if you think about all of our identity stuff, attributes, is going to end up on this thing, and the rails to this thing, this environment belongs to two multi-trillion-dollar companies. Let's say about identity in the future, right? So that's my demo. Thank you. Oh, I'm Don Thibault. I used to run a company called LexisNexis, and then an organization called the OpenID Foundation, which provides the technical standards for most identity systems at scale. OpenID Connect is used by Apple and Google, and I also started an organization called OIX, which, unlike the technical tools, looks at the governance rules of things like liability. And then I also work for a venture capital firm. Hi, Kay.
Thanks, Don. I'm Kay Chopard. I'm the executive director of the Kantar Initiative. The Kantar Initiative is a nonprofit based here in the U.S., and it is a member organization. And one of the things that we do is we run an assurance program where technology solutions, including even some of the companies that have been named, have come to Kantara because what we do is we accredit whether these solutions meet the standards established by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, specifically on identity. So 863 is the NIST regulation. It focuses on identity proofing, identity assurance, authentication assurance, and federation assurance. And we run a program that looks at the technology solutions, not into the level of the proprietary trade secrets, if you will, but we use third-party assessors who look at this. They look at the governance, they look at the policies in place, and what we're doing is assessing whether or not these technology solutions, like mobile driver's licenses, we hope in the future, are meeting those standards. NIST obviously is the standard that is used among federal agencies because they're required to use the NIST standards. But by virtue of that, what happens is those standards get adopted in industry. I also convene a group of folks from governments from around the world, many of them. In fact, they just asked me last month to let them meet with the folks at NIST because they're coming out with a new version of 863, and all of those governments rely heavily on the standards that were established there. So for us, I think, for us, meaning Kantara, what we're really interested in is that, and our belief, if you will, is that standards matter, and that as we're seeing the proliferation of these mobile credentials, wallets, mobile driver's licenses, and so on, and as we see them being used in states, you know, there are some countries where they have one license. I was just at a meeting in London talking with folks from the Singapore government. You get your identity at birth, and it's issued by the government of Singapore, and you have it. You're good to go. Well, that's not how it works here in the U.S., right? I've talked with other countries, and I said, well, you know, most everybody here uses a driver's license. Clearly, in their country, not the case. They were like, hardly anyone has a driver's license. So anyway, the point of that is just that what I think will be critical is that are we making sure that these technology solutions meet those standards? And those standards, if properly in place, will make sure that we protect the privacy of the people using those things, like those credentials, like some of the examples that Maria gave us in the very beginning, right? Where otherwise, right now, we're taking a photo of a photo, and we're actually sharing all of our private information, which we could buy online and have it all completely different, right? So there's a lot of issues there, which is why it's important that these, as this emerging technology, if you will, is really being used, that we make sure that it meets those standards. And the other thing that we do when we do that is that we maintain the security of those systems. So we're protecting the users. And just one last thing, and I confess I'm probably the newest person to the digital identity world. I'm actually a lawyer by training, and I came at this from the courts. And what's sort of interesting is that in many ways, I think the blessing, if you will, or the silver lining out of the pandemic was it forced us to be able to do things virtually that we never could before. And certainly from my background in the courts, you know, it was unheard of to be doing something like a hearing of any kind virtually. And now that's completely changed. And I think what's also changed is now our users have an expectation that we're going to offer them those kinds of conveniences, if you will. And mobile driver's licenses and credentials fall right into that same thing. I think that more and more we're getting an expectation that we're going to be able to do that. For anyone who might work in government, though, that presents other challenges, and that really goes to concerns about equity, accessibility, and really figuring out, it's great that we have these technology solutions, but if I'm providing services to everyone, does everyone have that same access? And if they don't, what can we do? How do we mitigate for that? So there's a lot of things that have to go into the balance. And I think in talking before we got here, we were all sort of saying this is like the hottest new thing, and is definitely the future, but it's kind of one of those where the technology could be way out here, and we just have to make sure that we're protecting users before it gets too far out the gate, if you will, and too far down the road. So, as I said, Kantara is all about standards, and our assurance program is something that we really feel can add to helping make sure that this gets implemented in a privacy-enhancing and secure way.
Great. Thanks. Good afternoon. I am Regina Udom Ratanavasi. I am with the Office of the Federal CIO, which is in the Office of Management and Budget. I am a policy analyst working on all things digital identity related. I'm actually on detail with OMB from the Social Security Administration, where I was a digital identity product manager and program lead, and I've been doing that for a few years now. I think one of the most exciting developments happening in digital identity right now is this potential for passwordless, phishing-resistant authentication in government services. I think traditional multi-factor authentication has long had some issues, whether it's with the password itself, and this isn't new information, I think we're all aware of this, but passwords aren't secure and they're not usable, and we've imposed draconian policy requirements on them in an attempt to make them more secure, which has only made them even less usable. So I think second factors are prone to phishing attacks and aren't as secure as we'd like for them to be either. So we've got the introduction of FIDO2 web authentication standards now that really thread that needle and serves a rare opportunity, or creates a rare opportunity to actually improve both security and usability using public key cryptography. So I think it's going to shift the burden that we've had in the public and the burden that we've had on our users to keep up with the latest security principles and practices and make sure that they know the website or the application that they're interacting with is in fact the website or the application that they think it is, which isn't that our job in digital identity to be doing, to know who the user is. I think with web authentication and FIDO2, we're going to be able to shift that burden back to technology, and I think it's a common theme here. It's going to improve accessibility and create some transparency there for our users.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're playing musical mics. Sorry,
Yes.
guys.
I'll be moving around. Thanks, everybody, for the introductions and the initial thoughts. Also, just wanted to say, if anyone in the audience has questions, please, feel free to raise a hand. And okay, there we go.
Yes, ma'am.
Sure. Yeah, let's see if we can help you out. There we go.
Yeah.
The FIDO2 authenticator is going to...
Thanks. This is Judith Halsey in the fascinating panel. So my question is, with the age of, phones getting stolen and robbed and SIM swapping or the other type of things, when we're all on, everything's on the phone, what happens in the authentication process of, if no one has any paper ones, how do we get those replaced, or how do we stop this identity fraud that's happening, which is, in my mind, is only going to increase when people lose their IDs or get their IDs stolen if everything is all centralized. When you had paper, you can actually showcase it, and you can get new credentials if you were stolen or that type of thing. But when it's all online and you lose access to it, it seems to me that's going to be even worse of a problem. And I would love to hear your responses to that. Thanks.
Does anybody feel like taking the first crack at this one? I feel like one of the important things is revocation, online revocation, and paper documents are not going to go away completely. That would be one of the first things I would say.
Right, and Zach, that's a great point. So one thing you can do with mobile credentials, with digital credentials that you cannot do with the paper ones, is that you can actually revoke them. And so it's like revoking your credit card. And so you can have them canceled to make them unusable. They can also be locked on your device with a password, with biometrics. And as far as getting them back, FIDO has a new approach. I think it's the keychain that's going to be implemented across platforms to help with recovery. But you will still need the paper documents as backup in case things go so awry that you need to reestablish those digital documents and credentials. Anyone else?
So your question was, what happens when? Fraud will continue to go up. We'll be less secure. We'll be increasingly more stratified. We'll have a society of those with smartphones and those that don't have access or limited access. So I think inclusion will become even more of an issue. And I think government systems will further lag behind commercial ones. Government systems are, by law, often paper-based, and by budgets, often underfinanced. and don't have systems to keep up with big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera. So I think that's where we're heading. I think the challenge before government managers is to try and understand that and find strategies that are inclusive and offer a level playing field for people in the commercial world.
Which kind of brings me to one of the first question, well, second question technically I wanted to ask the panel is, so what are some of the more pressing challenges that you all see when it comes to digital identity? And Kay, I know you had some specific thoughts on this when it comes to the equity and inclusion part of the conversation around digital identity, which I think is critical.
Yes, thank you, Zach. So I think that Don has already kind of talked about some of that, and it has come up in our discussions here. But I think the issue, we often think about, what's been in the news, at least here in Washington, D.C., is a lot about facial recognition, algorithms, did they get it wrong, and those kinds of worries. There's also other kind of accessibility issues that sometimes I think we don't think about, and for government we really have to. So I think Don's comment about, we could end up with those who have smartphones and those who don't. But there's other situations where it doesn't even get to the smartphone, because I've just been talking, in fact, with probation and parole officers earlier this week, who were saying how even the most indigent of offenders seem to have some kind of a phone. But what we're seeing is there are also places, and I'm originally from rural America, where broadband is not always easily accessible. If I live in Indian country, I might not have any access at all. So, my cell phone, my smartphone is a paperweight until I get someplace where I actually have that access, right? And then the other thing I think that we also sort of forget about when it comes to inclusion is also in many ways age-based. So what do my kids do? What are they going to have for digital identities, and will I have supervision over that? Because that's clearly an area that could be ripe for fraud. But the other is my elderly mother, who I have to talk through every time she has to do something on her computer. And we, and that segment of the population in the US anyway is growing. It is not shrinking. And so that's a whole nother area of inclusion that sometimes we haven't really thought about. And of course, with that also comes other disabilities. Hard to take a selfie if I am sight impaired. May not be able to figure that one out very well. And if I'm hearing impaired or hard of hearing, how do I do some of the things in terms of being able to respond? And while we have devices that help for that, I think that what has often happened is we have developed for the mainstream, for sort of what we would call the average user. And I think what will happen as we go down this road is that we will be challenged to how can we make this inclusive for everyone. And I've just given you a bunch of different examples, but it's the kind of thing where we have to be able to think outside the box because I don't think there's any turning back. So how can we make this work?
Yeah, I think about the use case when I was supporting a state agency, and it's like they were trying to apply for Medicaid, and they're using a public library terminal. And even if you don't have a driver's license or you can't submit a government document that way, like a lot of identity proofing companies will say, oh, well, they can use the device fingerprint or the serial number or the operating system. And it's like, well, if you're using a public computer in a library, you can't use that information in order to identity proof someone. So there still is the equity conversation in identity is becoming more prominent, which I'm happy to see because it's critical that everybody has access to these. And so, I definitely think that is one of the larger challenges out there. Does anybody else have thoughts?
Yeah, the issues around equity are a huge problem in the space. And it's something where we really need government to get more involved because the private sector, they're going to be focused on the customers who have money, the people who can buy the latest iPhone. And so they're not going to be creating solutions for that population because there's no incentive to do so. Which also, broaches another issue. I mean, the government does need to address this. They're the ones who have the capability to do it. But in general, the United States has not had the political will to focus on improving our cybersecurity posture. There is a bill that is making its way slowly out of committee, hopefully, on improving digital identity. It was introduced last year. It went nowhere. And just in the past year, I think it was about, a report just came out a couple of days ago that said it was about $280 billion, which I have a hard time wrapping my head around, in just fraudulent government benefit payments last year alone. And there still wasn't enough will to get this very basic bill out and turned into a law that wouldn't solve these problems. It would just look at them. It would just lay the foundation to start understanding what the problems are and to start creating a roadmap towards that solution. So we really need to get moving in the United States and start tackling these with some degree, these issues with some degree of urgency.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that, you know, this adoption is going to be driven by one fundamental thing, which is trust, right? So it's simply how cohesively we act across these different stakeholders, state government or the federal government or the private sector. I think that will drive the adoption to it. And I think the other thing that, you know, we typically run into, because I focus on federal health equity platforms, right? The issues that we raised into users being on, you know, in reservations where people have no accessibility. We often get questions that, hey, we are OCONUS, I'm a US citizen, but I'm living outside of the United States. So can the Department of State play a role in this? Can the Postal Service play a role in this? You know, how do we get a referee-based verification process? If I don't have a phone, I can have an opportunity to go in person, but to verify. I think to have a trust in the fact that I have different modalities that can help me verify and bring my core identity to where I need to, I think that becomes, you know, it's going to be driven by a lot of the trust, which all of these stakeholders have to come together to provide.
Yeah, whether or not the Foster and the Cinema bill happen is an interesting question, Don. That one I think is up for debate. But the encouraging thing is there is appropriations language in the CHIPS Plus bill for NIST for NIST appropriations to do an digital identity framework research. So, and that CHIPS Plus is like it passed the Senate, it's in the House, things are looking positive on that front. So there is money for NIST to study this, which is going to be a net positive.
Even the cybersecurity framework, I think where NIST is looking at labeling for the customer IoT devices and software, right? I think now we are going to transition into a world of using phones or, you know, talking through Alexas and the Google phones, but the cybersecurity labeling of all of the software that we use and put the onus on making sure that label clearly indicates sort of what we can say identity bill of rights. You know, as me, if I'm using this platform, what does that mean? What data is stored? How is it stored? How is it going to be going from AWS to a Google to whoever, right? I think that is a good step forward to start putting that identity bill of rights and labeling of it.
Any other thoughts on some of the pressing challenges that we see with digital identity that anyone wants to share?
Looking for some other hot questions from the audience.
Hi, Richard Van Horn, thank you very much. I'm a consumer focused on privacy. And my biggest worry is once we have this kind of connected identity and someone steals my identity, I am in such trouble because it's all connected. This person now has my entire identity, not just a small piece where it's my credit card information. So that's a big worry of mine. So that's kind of a question. How can that be solved? And what are the plans to solve that problem? That makes any sense, or what is it?
Identity attributes are one of the ways that can be solved by instead of having to be, like, yes, your identity in one central place, but it also will be, you can assert different attributes depending on the transaction. So, and getting into the whole digital identity would be pretty difficult, I think.
So, can I talk about wallets some more?
For the remote audience, though, you got to talk into the mic.
I do have to talk into the mic. I think you're right to be concerned. I think it's very easy to steal identities, particularly if you're an older person or have some of the other disadvantages that people talk about. Identities are being stolen all the time. Your data is being sold and resold all the time. So what can be done about that? To me, one thing that this wallet thing that I've been talking about offers, and I mentioned again the mobile driver's license, which is in the parlance, the technology parlance, is called a verifiable credential, right? It's my Maryland's driver's license is verified by the state of Maryland, and it's in here. The digital wallet allows you to have some control over those identity aspects. If you think about identity this way, think about identity as a bag with attributes in it. And if you shake the bag, you can hear the clinking of coins. Attributes are where the money is. We sell people red shoes because we understand what their identity behavior is. What we're trying to do with this wallet thing is to offer people control over the release of that data about them, instead of letting others make that determination for us, whether it be Google or Apple or Facebook. So we hope to give the goal in this Web 3.0 digital wallet world is agency over your identity attributes. Because in my opinion, privacy is not obtainable. It's not practical. There is no privacy in identity data. No, I believe that to be true.
Yeah, and as Don mentioned, with the mobile driver's license, you'll have a lot more control, in theory, if it's implemented properly. And if it's secured on the secure portion of your phone, not on the SIM card, with a biometric and a PIN, it's going to be far more secure than what you have today. Right now, if anyone needs our identity information, we have to give them our entire driver's license, our entire passport. And they're going to get our name, our address, our phone number, our weight 5 years ago. I mean, tons of information that they don't need for the transaction. And so, for example, if all that you really need to prove is your name, or I'm over 21, or I live in the state of Maryland, you can just share, if the credential is done properly, that relevant information. If someone just needs to know I'm a citizen of Maryland, I can just share the fact that I'm a citizen of Maryland securely and not my exact address within the state of Maryland. And so it's going to actually enable much greater privacy than we have today. And right now, all of my data has been stolen. You know, I was part of that OMB breach a few years ago. So, I mean, another government has my fingerprints, everything about me. And that's true of a lot of us. So we need other mechanisms at this point.
I think with that mobile driver's license and the wallet strategy, right, I think one of the things, there's no real right answer. It's very hard to implement digital identity, being on the fence when we are coming up with solutions, right? We talk about, hey, there is a lack of centralized data source, but that raises the issue that if that data source is compromised, you know, you're at the mercy of all of your information going. So, you know, the digital identity world hopefully will coexist in an ecosystem which is centralized to establish certain core attributes about me as who I am, like your aspects of your digital license, and some decentralized authoritative sources. So, you know, my degree from a university, my diploma, if I'm a nurse or I'm a doctor, I get to choose what are the certain things that I want to be part of my core identity. So if I walk out from one ecosystem to the other, I can pick and choose that if I'm applying for a loan, I just need to prove I'm over 21. Like Maria said, you know, that's the only information about me. Here's my background. If I'm applying for a job, you know, I have a way that university will allow me to trust those transcripts on my phone. So, you know, the information that can be released is completely under my control. So I think it's the centralized, the decentralized, and the federated ecosystem of, you know, me trusting my university or my DMV, etc., is something it's a hard problem to solve, but I think that's where it will get to.
But you know, we haven't heard from OMB lately.
Yeah, I think, let's scoot this over. As mentioned, digital identity is hard, and we're facing a lot of challenges. So just to add on to some of those challenges, and Maria, you mentioned this one earlier, it is the inability of the U.S. government to access its own data. The government has long been issuing identity documents, whether that was at the federal level with passports or at the state level with state-issued IDs and driver's licenses. But unfortunately, that physical world and these physical credentials has not caught up with the digital world and what we need to do to know who our users are online. So I think it's really important that that we be able to validate this information with other agencies, allow them to share information, because it does go a long way to prevent certain types of identity theft and fraud. And it also goes a long way to improve our customers' experience and get more of our customers successfully through the identity proofing process, which ultimately builds a better government for all, which is what we're trying to do.
Recently, as part of the Better Identity Coalition, we're working on a document that should hopefully be released in the next month or two. It's a state blueprint for digital identity. And basically what we're going to be recommending is a lot of put the DMV at the center, and a lot of focus on mobile driver's license. But as we were putting together the document, we had originally, well, it's still in there, but I debated whether or not to keep it in there. In 1993, there was the New Yorker cartoon, like, you know, it's the dog online. You know, online nobody knows that you're a dog. And I was like, God, it's been 30 years. I can't believe it's been like, and even earlier today, before the session we were talking about, it's like, yeah, it's dealing with a lot of the same problems that we were dealing with previously. So it's, you know, I think we're a lot closer now. I think what we're seeing with mobile driver's license is encouraging. You know, the challenge with mobile driver's license at this point, they're only being used for online or in-person use cases. Like you could use the TSA to get through the airport. One of the things that I'm looking forward to is those online use cases where you could take those attributes, log into your state DMV, I mean, state DMV is not a good one, but log into your Department of Natural Resources so that you can buy a fishing license and prove that you're a resident of the state of Illinois and buy a fishing license or a hunting license without having to enter all that information. Like I went fishing last week and I had to like enter my social security number, my driver's license number, and all this stuff into the Illinois DNR site in order to prove that to save $5 on a fishing license, which I'm like I said, this is making me real nervous. So, but these are things that they're happening, and I'm excited to see that happening. Yeah, Jonathan.
So to be clear, you're involved with digital identities, and for the savings of $5, you were willing to hand all this stuff over. You had the option of spending $5 more, but you're like, nope, I'm giving you my social security number.
I still would have had to give them my social security number, just even though, because they wanted to know where I was coming from. And it's like, so either way, I'm like, this is an example of a state agency, like, why do you need this information? Like, again, when I supported a state agency at one point, I'm like, we would do security security reviews, and I'm like, what's the business justification for collecting a social security number for a fishing license? I want to know what happened in that conference room when they were having that conversation where it's like an address. You could do address verification via USPS in order, somebody enters their address. Now, yes, that's easily, you know, you could commit fraud that way and know that somebody lives at a certain address and do it, but at the same time, like, yeah, I knew, like, basically, yes, I saved $5, I gave them the information, but they're going to get the information one way or the other in order for me to get the fishing license. And I want to spend the $25 rather than potentially get fined hundreds of dollars if somebody were to really come across me. So that was where I was at.
Can I add to kind of pick up of what you're, so just one of the things that I think is unfortunate in the U.S. is we have trained our users, our consumers, our citizens, our residents, everybody. We've trained you that it's all or nothing. You give me everything about you and I'll let you have access. If you just want to give me part of it, nope, you don't get any access. So we've trained our users to where the only way I can use this service, the only way I can buy this online, the only way I can participate in a virtual meeting is I have to give my life away. And we've now sort of trained everybody that that's it. It's all or nothing. That's the rule in the US. And I think that what I would like to see is more leadership from government, people like Regina, from state governments, from relying parties, from people who are supposed to be thinking about the user experience, who have things like a fishing license, to think before they act. And instead of jumping to, well, let's get everything from these people, to start taking a leadership role, which I personally don't think that they've done. Because they haven't had to, because we've trained everybody, you have to give us everything, or, we don't give you anything. And I think instead we should be saying to them, you are our leadership. We expect better, think before you act. What is it you really need to have? And how can we be more user-friendly, if you will, to our consumers so that we aren't training them that in order to live in this world, you have to be willing to share everything about yourself. And of course, the other issue goes back to the point raised earlier about all of this data. Because we do that, and because we've been willing to say, that's how you get services, now we've allowed for breaches where all of that information is sold all over the place, often for very little money, right? And so we worry about, well, is this going to be worse with the digital identity? And maybe, I think to Don's point, maybe it will be. But that said, we're already a mess. We're already sharing that stuff out there. And so if we're going to pull it back, then I think we need to start expecting more from our leadership, because I've heard people talk about, we need to educate people more. No, we don't have to educate the user. I'm not designing the stupid system, you are. You can't think about this? I'm just, obviously, I'm on my soapbox a little here, but I'm just saying that I feel like in the US, we need to step back and take a new approach. And I think that it would be wonderful if the move to wallets and mobile credentials and mobile driver's license, what might serve as the impetus for us to do a better job and for us to create a different kind of scenario and interaction than we've really allowed to develop over time. And, with my background in law, I will tell you there are so many laws on the books that are written for paper that we don't do paper anymore. And yet we haven't gone back and updated our legislation. So we are stuck with rules that make a whole lot of sense in a paper system and don't make much sense in the virtual digital world that we work in and live in now. So, there's a lot to be done. But I also think it's really encouraging, right? Because we're having these kinds of conversations. We're all recognizing that these are things we have to tackle. And hopefully we'll be able to really develop that impetus so that we can make a change. And we don't have to go down the path we've started. We can pick a new one.
Yeah, Kay, when I was working at the state agency, they're like, we were doing review, and I'm like, why are we collecting all this data? And the response I legitimately got was, because we can. And I was like, no. Like, we can't. I'm like, this is going to put us at risk. And I'm like, but this is how we've always done things, which is also another great response. And I'm like, I said, I'm going to go talk to the chief privacy officer, and they're going to be on my side of this, and we need to not collect as much data. I'm like, what happens when we get breached and we end up on the front page of the local big newspaper? Like, nobody wants that. And they're like, well, maybe you're right. But yeah, it's the exact same thing. It's a change in mindset, especially with you're dealing with some architects and developers. They're like, I want everything I could possibly get. That's not the right way to look at things these days. It's never been the right way to look at things.
Right, and the only way it's going to change is if we have something equivalent to the GDPR in the United States, learning lessons from their mistakes, of course, because industry is incentivized to collect as much data as possible, because they make money off of it. So the only solution is to legislate a solution that prevents that. Otherwise, it will never change, because people are not going to lose money or even be inconvenienced by having to think differently if there's absolutely no financial incentive to do so. And in fact, there are rewards to collecting all this data.
Exactly. Any questions from the audience at this point? No?
Yes, and you, as Judith Hellison again, and you actually answering the question I was going to ask is that when we try to give less data, they say, no, you can't get this service because you have to fill in all these boxes. And it's a form, and they make you fill it out. And if you either have to, if you want the service, you either have to agree to do it or not. And when is it yet? So the question is, has the California law made any difference in requiring less data, or is that going to be, something that we can look forward to in the incoming privacy legislation that's apparently every year they say is going to happen, and now this year it's probably going to happen? But how do we stop collecting the data so that we don't get impinged or or lose our identity, especially as we're going forward to a paperless environment? And what is this something that could be in the works in the privacy legislation that can halt that, or is it just we're doomed?
I have thoughts, I don't know if I should. I am not particularly encouraged with the current privacy legislation that's out there. I think that it's going to undermine what's going on in California. And I wish we would have something a little bit stronger. That would be my, I'm not, again, what's going on with the federal privacy legislation, I don't think is ideal from my perspective. And again, it could, like, Governor Newsom wrote a letter saying that he fears that this is going to undermine what they have going on in California at this point. All right, no one else wants to take on that tough one. All right, I think we have like 15 more minutes, I think. We're till 2:15? Okay. So let's move on. So where do you think we'll be with digital identity in like 3 years and in 5 years? Let's ask that one. So how are things going to change by 2025, 2028?
Are we all doomed?
Yeah, right?
I didn't answer that question for a reason.
All right.
Go ahead. No. So let's take, for discussion's sake, no legislative or regulatory remedy within the next 3 years. I think that's fair. That there's no, the privacy cavalry is not coming over the hill. So what does that mean? I think it means something in the long range, which is government increasingly is moving out of being the sun in the solar system to being just one of the planets. Where what's really happening in identity in terms of technology, in terms of new services, in terms of surveillance, really is going to be dictated by the big tech players. I think for the next 3 years, they will play the fiddle and will continue to dance to it. It's hard to see the government marshaling its forces from a political point of view. And it's hard to see government catching up from a technical point of view. The advances in machine learning and big data and AI are so far outstripping most commercial rivals, certainly most government agencies, with the exception of some in defense and intelligence agencies. So I think the honest answer to the question about the next 3 years is we continue to live in a surveillance society, and we continue to be the product. We give them our data, they give them their services. And I think that's the way it's going to be for the next 3 years. I'm dedicated to changing that, but not from a privacy point of view, but from an antitrust and commercial point of view. I'd be interested in your thoughts as well.
That's a hard one.
Yeah. I mean, if you see from the
But
lens.
that's why we're on the panel. And
Exactly. But hey, it's just to be authentic about the fact that, as a user, those are also our concerns, right? And as somebody where we look at somebody who looks at saying, hey, go solve the problem, and that's hard as well. So I think it's hard on both sides of the fences, and I think from 3 years from now, I think I agree with you. I don't think there's going to be a lot of change. And as a user, I would really want something like a personal wallet that I can carry and have, but I have the choice to say that I'm fine with the wallet when I'm in this ecosystem versus when I'm in the physical world, I have an option to do something else. I think to have that choice is what I look forward to as a user. But I think the hard thing, and I hope that from 5 years from now, that will be the case, where when we published a paper and we were talking about what would we look like for my child, and that's exactly that they're born and I don't have to worry about my social security card to be given to get the birth certificate. They graduate and they can get some of those transcripts on their wallet, and they can apply for a job, and they can move on to apply for their taxes and get the refunds online and things as such, right? So I think that would be a very cool state if we were to sell this to the youth of today. But the situations around my mom or my grandmother and I as a caretaker in the physical world will be very different. From implementation side of things, I think to just make sure that bring the right stakeholders to the table and the common vision that we should have towards identity, I think that's huge, right? Like, what's our common goal as all of the roles that we play today? I think that common vision to put that revolution and start that revolution, and 3 and 5 years from now, what's our common vision for identity? I think that, to me, will be key, and not any of us can do that individually, so it's got to be a revolution, like I said. So for me, that's where we are heading to try solving the problems of digital identity.
Hey, Regina.
Well, I'll try not to get on my soapbox again, but, it is kind of discouraging. And I mean, I think that some of the things that Don has said, I wish were not true, and I'm not sure that they won't be. But I will say this, I feel like there are places of light that give me hope, right? So I see it in technology firms who are, so for example, Kantara, I told you we're a nonprofit, and we just recently, just in the last month, sent out a survey to companies, right, on diversity, equity, inclusion. And do you care about this, and what are you doing about it? And what we were looking at was, taking sort of the temperature of the marketplace and also trying to gauge, is there a business case for all of these things that we're talking about? What is the business case? Or is it just, let's, mine everybody's data, take as much as we can, and that's how we get paid, which sounds very cynical and greedy. But, so, it's an anonymous survey, so I can't identify for you, but I will tell you this, that companies who have participated, some of them are multi-billion-dollar companies. So, and what was encouraging is there are clearly companies looking at their solutions and spending hundreds of millions in dollars of trying to figure this out. So, you know what? It wasn't 1,000 companies, but just the fact that there are some who are devoting resources, not just their thought, not just their personnel, devoting money to trying to figure out, how can we do this better? How can we change this model? Now, they're looking at it, I think, from the lens of how can we change this and still make money, right? So I don't want to make it sound like they've suddenly become altruistic and they don't care about, the bottom line. I think they still do. But I'm encouraged that there are those who are trying to think about this. At Kantara, we have what we call work groups, which are made up of people with subject matter expertise, and they're typically working on cutting-edge issues. And we have one on privacy-enhancing mobile credentials. And there are many organizations at the table, and is this being recorded? Can I say this out loud? So a very large company that would be engaged in mobile credentials, who shall remain nameless, came to me and said, we want to be part of this work group because we want to figure out how to make our wallet feature more private. And how can we roll this out in a way that's privacy enhancing? And we see what you're doing and we want to be a part of that, which is exciting, right? And so some of the people that were saying, well, they're just out to make a buck, you know, those to me are the glimmers of hope, that there are those who are interested and who do want to try to do this differently and change the model. And I think change the marketplace and change the business case. I don't know if it's at a tipping point, but it's a start. And so I'm going to hang on to that and hope that in the next 3 to 5 years, that'll keep growing. And I think with people like those of us on the panel, pushing and encouraging and trying to find ways to help get to that different place, maybe we can make some progress. We probably won't turn the world around in 3 to 5 years, but you never know.
I want to try to be optimistic about this as well. I am encouraged by mobile driver's license, digital wallets, the ability. I think companies are not going to be able to take the fire hose of information for much longer. I think that it's going to come down to, you know, there's going to be companies that are going to be like, going to give you the option to assert certain attributes at different times, and that's what the companies are going to have to deal with. I think it's going to be, the consumers are going to see that ability to do things. They already see it with Apple right now. You don't have to give up your email address to open accounts where you can use your Apple login. I think that's a great first step. And I'm a big fan of MDL. The in-person use cases right now are encouraging, but I'm hoping in 3 years we start seeing more online use cases to where it's like you can log into state services with your MDL and be able to pay your taxes with your MDL, access different, you know, book a federal campground with your mobile driver's license, but also not having to give up all your information, give up select information that's only necessary. I see a shift in the mindset of folks out there. It's slow, but I think that it's going to continue, and I'm excited about the fact that we're not going to have to give up. I'm not going to have to give up my social security number and all this other data in order to buy a fishing license, hopefully in 3 years. That's my hope as well. So, are there any other questions from the audience? Okay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Drazik. I work for VeriSign. I have a question about the impact of the patchwork of regulation that we're starting to see develop. There was a reference to the CCPA. We obviously know about GDPR. In the context of identity and digital identity, are there any thoughts about how, in a cross-jurisdictional way, that this can evolve? Because while we have this patchwork of regulation and legislation, that there's clearly some tension there. And we start talking about privacy and principles of data minimization. How does that translate cross-border? And so, you know, if we're talking about in a particular state, that's one thing. If we're talking about in the United States with multiple different, different implementations or different regulations on the books, but you start talking globally, it becomes that much more complicated. So how does, it's probably a bigger question than we have time left in the next 5 minutes, but how does this translate when you start talking about, the use of a digital or an identity in a global context, cross-border? Thanks.
So I lead a group that's working on that problem. Global interoperability, digital identity sharing between governments and banks, et cetera. And yes, it's a wicked problem. But I want to offer some uplifting, positive, but we have sorted this out. And proof that we've sorted out international interoperability and greater sharing of digital identity credentials, verified credentials, is actually getting some traction outside of the US. Because there's powerful economic forces that want there to be greater global trade with less friction without the skyrocketing amount of fraud that we have. But it's really hard to harmonize and provide an interoperable kind of trust framework. But it has been done. It's been done in the credit card system. Credit cards began with lots of different banks with their own credit cards, and they basically created a trust framework. And it also remarkably works in this world as well, where I can use this phone in London or in Shanghai or in Peoria, yet there are very different regulations involved, very different technical standards. So I think there is hope in trust framework and the requirement for both government and the private sector to work together. I think it's going to continue to be painful. I think it's going to be generational. I don't think there's much hope for people of my generation, but for that young woman, she's a digital native, and she's much more adept at the agency that we're talking about of managing the data about you and sharing it on a basis that's under your control, not the control of some private company. So I think that's where we're going. I think it's a generational shift, and we're just kind of the collateral damage as we move from Web 2 to Web 3. We're the pioneers.
Yeah, well, and there is also legislation, like in the U.S., there is digital identity legislation that's currently in the House and Senate that would look, basically it says that there should be research task force done so that digital identity, at least in the U.S., is standardized throughout so that, and this is the whole thing about mobile driver's license, which now I feel like we're saying it over and over again, even though it is one of the more exciting developments, is it's a standards-based approach. So a mobile driver's license issued in Illinois would be valid in D.C., Virginia, everywhere, as long as you are following that standard. And even in Germany or France or anywhere else, it's an international standard. As long as you follow that standard, it would be able to be used anywhere. So I'm a big fan of standards-based approaches for everything. Well, if there's nothing else, I would like to, again, thank my panelists for today and thank the audience for your participation. Appreciate it. And let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.